The morning the quarterly ledgers were presented to the household, Nora Vane was standing at the far end of the long table in the Hartwell estate office. Her fingers pressed flat against a column of figures the steward, Mr. Peel, had declared unsolvable for 3 consecutive quarters. The candles had not been lit yet. The winter light through the tall windows was gray and thin, and she was using it by tilting the page at an angle, the way she had learned to do when her father's study grew dark and he refused to spend a tallow stub on more light. The figures were wrong. She knew they were wrong because she had added them 4 times, in 4 different orders, and they came to 4 different sums, none of which matched the total written at the bottom of the page in Mr. Peel's careful, confident hand. She heard him before she saw him. Not Mr. Peel. The other one. The Earl of Hartwell entered the estate office the way he entered every room, without announcing himself, without apparent hurry, and with the particular quality of stillness that made other people feel they had been standing in the wrong place. He was not tall, the way some men made themselves tall, by bearing or by elevation. He was simply present, in the manner of stone outcroppings in a field, things that had always been there and would continue long after everything softer had worn away. He stopped 3 feet inside the door when he saw her. He did not speak. Nora did not lower the ledger. She had learned, in the 8 weeks since she had come to Hartwell as a housemaid, that the worst thing a woman in her position could do was to appear guilty of whatever she had not yet been accused of. She was looking at the accounts because Mrs. Albright, the housekeeper, had asked her to find the quarter's tallies for the coal delivery, and the tallies were in the ledger, and the ledger had errors in it. She had not done anything wrong. "That belongs to the estate office," said the Earl. His voice was low. Not threatening. Simply a fact. "Yes, my lord," she said. "Mrs. Albright sent me to find the coal figures. The November delivery." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary to process the information. Then he said, "And have you found them?" "I have found something else as well," she said, and then stopped herself because she was a housemaid, and Mr. Peel was the estate steward of 22 years' standing, and the Earl of Hartwell had not asked for her opinion of his accounts. He was still watching her, and his expression had not closed the way it sometimes did, when a servant spoke out of turn. It had done something else. The gray of his eyes had sharpened. "What have you found?" he said, and it was not quite a question. She set the ledger down on the table. She turned it so that the figures faced him, and she placed one finger at the bottom of the column. "The total," she said, "does not follow from the numbers above it." The room held its breath. She held hers. The season had not been kind to Nora. This was the word the other housemaids used among themselves, though they did not use it to her face. They said the season had not been kind to her, as if the season were a person capable of deciding such things, as if its cruelties were weather rather than machinery. What they meant was that Nora had come down in the world in a manner so complete that the world had mostly stopped noticing her, and that this was, by certain measurements, the cruelest thing the season could have done. Her father, Mr. Robert Vane, had been a man of some education and small income, a solicitor's clerk who spent his evenings teaching his only daughter Latin declensions and the principles of double-entry bookkeeping, not because he thought she would ever have use of them, but because he found her quick, and quickness delighted him. He had not survived the winter of 1817. He had left behind him a house that belonged to his landlord, a collection of books that were sold to pay the physician, and a daughter of 22 with excellent needlework, serviceable French, and a working knowledge of account ledgers that no employer had yet found relevant to her hire. For that was the other thing. Nora was not the kind of young woman the season saw. She was not poor enough to attract charitable notice, not pretty enough to attract advantageous notice, not well connected enough to attract any other kind. She had presented herself at 4 households before Hartwell, and at each of them she had been assessed in the entry hall and found wanting in some quality she did not possess and could not acquire. At Hartwell, she had been engaged as a housemaid on the strength of her references and the housekeeper's opinion that she looked capable, and she had been grateful for it in the way one is grateful for ground underfoot. To the other servants, she was simply the new girl who did not complain. To Mr. Peel, she was invisible. He had looked through her at the introductions and had not looked at her again in 8 weeks, which suited her well enough. To the Earl of Hartwell, in these 8 weeks, she had been something she could not yet name. She had been the object of a quality of attention she did not know how to account for, the same way she could not account for a column of figures that refused to balance. She was aware of him, always, in any room they occupied together. Not because he sought her out. He never did. His stillness was particular, and particular stillness in a large man who did not waste movement had a way of registering even at the edge of a room. The first time she had noticed it was 6 weeks earlier, in the library. She had been replacing books on the lower shelves, a task assigned to her because Mrs. Albright had noted that she handled them with care, and the Earl had entered without seeing her behind the shelving cart, and she had heard him stop when she stood up. She had turned, apologized for startling him, and returned to her work. When she glanced back from the doorway, he had not yet moved to his desk. The second time was in the kitchen passage, where she had been reading a receipt book by the window light during her dinner break. He had come through the passage, which he rarely did, and paused when he saw the book in her hands. He had not asked her what she was reading. He had said only, "The light is better in the servants' hall at this hour." She had thanked him, and not moved. He had continued down the passage without looking back, and she had noticed, 2 hours later, that someone had set a candle on the windowsill. She had not read anything particular into either of these moments. She was a housemaid. He was an earl. The geometry of the world was plain, and she had no cause to miscalculate it. Here she was, in the estate office, with her finger on a ledger that lied, and the Earl of Hartwell was looking at her as though she had just said something that mattered. He crossed to the table. He stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold room, and he looked at the column she had indicated. She watched his eyes move down the figures. She watched them stop. "Where does it diverge?" he said. She showed him. 3 lines from the bottom, a subtraction that had been performed incorrectly, not by accident, but by the kind of neatness that suggested it had been performed that way on purpose. The sum was small. 12 shillings in every ledger, across 12 months across. Several ledgers was not small. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been an accountant, Miss Vane?" "I am not an accountant, my lord. I am a housemaid." "That is not what I asked." She looked at the ledger. She said, "My father was a solicitor's clerk. He taught me what he knew." The Earl straightened. He picked up the ledger and closed it, and the motion was deliberate, the motion of a man who had just decided something and was closing the door behind his decision. "I would like you to review the remaining 6 ledgers," he said. "Today, if you are able." She thought of the grates she had not yet blacked. She thought of Mrs. Albright's face. She thought of Mr. Peel. "Mr. Peel will not like it," she said. "No," said the Earl. He did not add anything to this. He set the ledger back on the table and left the room, and she stood in the gray morning light and looked at the 6 remaining ledgers and understood that she had just been given an order that was going to cost her something, and that she was going to do it anyway. It was at supper that evening, in the servants' hall, that Mr. Peel first made his feelings plain. He had heard, from the footman Thomas, who had heard from the Earl's valet, that the new girl had spent the afternoon in the estate office. Mr. Peel arrived in the servants' hall with the particular quality of injured dignity that men of 22 years' standing develop as a kind of armor. He did not address her directly. This was his method. He spoke to Mrs. Albright loudly enough for the table to hear. "I understand," he said, "that the girl has been set loose among the accounts." Mrs. Albright looked up from her soup. Her expression was carefully neutral, the expression of a woman who had survived many Mr. Peels. "His lordship made the arrangement," she said. "A housemaid," said Mr. Peel. "Reviewing accounts." He said it the way he might have said a pig saddled and bridled, as a thing so contrary to the natural order as to be its own refutation. Nora ate her soup. She did not look up. The table was very quiet. "I spent the afternoon finding errors," she said, and kept her voice level, because she was not going to be silent in the servants' hall when her position was being disposed of by a man who had made errors in every ledger she had reviewed. Mr. Peel looked at her for the first time directly. He was a compact man with a face that had arranged itself over 22 years of authority into an expression of permanent mild surprise that anyone might question him. "Errors," he said. "Yes," she said. "In 6 ledgers. I have written them out." The table was entirely still. Mrs. Albright's spoon had stopped moving. "A housemaid," said Mr. Peel slowly, as though she had not spoken, as though he were simply repeating a fact that the room needed to hear again, "has no business with the estate accounts." Nora set down her spoon. She looked at him steadily. "Then someone," she said, "should have been minding them." She did not sleep well that night. She lay in her narrow room above the laundry and listened to the house settle around her, and thought about what she had done. She had not been wrong to say it. The errors were there. She had the written notes in her apron pocket. The Earl had asked her to find them, and she had found them, and she had reported them. Every part of this was correct. What was not correct was the feeling she could not put down, the feeling that she had placed herself between Mr. Peel and the Earl, in the way a person places themselves between a closed door and the wind. And that wind was not going to stop blowing because she was in the way. She thought about Mr. Peel's face. She thought about Mrs. Albright's careful silence. She thought about the Earl's gray eyes in the estate office, moving down the column of figures, stopping. She thought, "I have done nothing wrong." It was a thin comfort. She had done nothing wrong many times before. If you have ever sat with a woman who knows she is right and cannot make the world acknowledge it, you will know what kind of sleep Nora had that night. Stay with her a little longer. It began at breakfast the next morning, before the family was stirring, in the way that such things always begin, sideways, from a direction that looks like something else entirely. Mrs. Peel arrived at Hartwell. She had not been expected. Mr. Peel's wife drove up in a borrowed gig before 8 o'clock and was admitted to the housekeeper's sitting room, and the door was closed, and from the kitchen Nora could hear the murmur of voices through the walls, low and continuous, the sound of a story being told. She did not know what story. She knew only that when Mrs. Albright came out of the sitting room 40 minutes later, she did not meet Nora's eyes. The story, as it reached Nora piece by piece through the channels of a house that was too full of people to contain any secret entirely, was this. Mr. Peel had told his wife that he had been undermined by a girl who had no character and less breeding, a creature elevated above her station by a lord too distracted by grief to notice what he was being used for. The errors in the ledgers, Mr. Peel had told his wife, were the girl's own errors, introduced during the afternoon she had been left unsupervised among the accounts. The written notes she had submitted to the Earl were fabrications. Mr. Peel had the original ledgers to prove it. Nora heard this third hand from the kitchen maid Betsy, who had heard it from Thomas the footman, who had heard it in the way footmen hear things, which is from everywhere and nowhere. She heard it standing in the laundry passage with a basket of linen on her hip, and the basket felt, suddenly, very heavy. She set it down. She thought through everything clearly. The ledgers were in the estate office. The notes she had written were in the estate office. The Earl had the notes. What she did not have was a copy. This was the cost she had foreseen and had not been able to prevent. The morning continued. She did her work. She blacked the grates and remade 3 beds and carried hot water upstairs and did all of it with the methodical care she had learned to use when the ground was unsteady, the kind of care that makes the hands useful while the mind works at something else. What she was working at, steadily, in the back of her mind, was whether there was anything she had missed, whether any of the errors could be made to look like her errors. They could not. She was certain of this. She had not introduced the errors. She had no reason to introduce them. The only person with reason to introduce errors into an estate ledger was a person who intended to profit from the difference, and she did not have the access or the authority to profit from anything at Hartwell, except her wages, which were honest. She was certain of this. Certainty, she had learned, was not a defense. At 11 o'clock, she was summoned to the Earl's study. She had not been in the study before. It was at the front of the house, on the first floor, with tall windows that faced the drive, and the walls were dark with wood paneling, and the books were numerous and serious. Not the decorative sort arranged by color and height in other houses she had worked in. There was a portrait above the fireplace of a woman in an ivory gown, very young, with a look in her painted eyes that was not quite happiness and not quite something else. Nora noticed it and looked away. The Earl was standing at the window. Mr. Peel was standing near the desk. Both of them turned when she entered. She thought, "Here it is, then." Mr. Peel said nothing. He had the look of a man who had prepared thoroughly and was waiting for his preparation to do its work without requiring him to do anything further. The Earl said, "Mr. Peel has presented me with an account of yesterday's events." "I expected he would," said Nora. Her voice was steady. She was proud of this. "He says the errors you identified in the ledgers are your own." She looked at the Earl. She did not look at Mr. Peel. She said, "They are not." "He says you were alone in the estate office for the better part of an afternoon." "Yes." "He says that in that time you had sufficient access to alter." "The errors," Nora said, "are of the same kind in all 6 ledgers, the same method. A subtraction performed incorrectly, always in the same direction, always at the same position in the column. I found them in 6 ledgers spanning 18 months. I was in the estate office for 1 afternoon. I could not have introduced errors spanning 18 months. The errors were already there." Silence. She thought about the portrait above the fireplace. She kept her eyes on the Earl. He said, "The original ledgers." "Yes, my lord." "Mr. Peel has the originals, and says your notes are fabrications." "Then I would ask my lord to look at the originals," she said. "The errors will still be there. I wrote them down. I did not change them." She watched him. He was very still. The quality of his stillness had changed since the estate office, since the moment she had put her finger on the wrong total, and she could not have said how it had changed, only that it had, the way the light in a room changes when a cloud passes the window. Not dark, not less, only different. Mr. Peel said very quietly. "My lord, I have served this estate for 22 years. "You have," said the Earl. He did not take his eyes from Nora. "And this girl," said Mr. Peel, "has been here 8 weeks. 8 weeks, said the Earl, and she found what 22 years missed. Mr. Peel made a small sound. The Earl moved from the window. He went to the desk and opened the top drawer and removed the ledger that Nora had set on the table the previous morning, the first one, the one she had been holding in the gray light when he had entered. He opened it to the page she had shown him. He looked at it. He picked up the notes she had written, which were lying beside the ledger on the desk, and compared them to the page. "Mr. Peel," he said without looking up, "you will submit your keys to Mrs. Albright today. I will send to Taunton for the solicitor by the end of the week." Mr. Peel left the room. He left it differently from how he had entered it, which is the only thing that needs to be said about that. The Earl set down the ledger. He looked at Nora. He said, "You have been badly used by this house." "I have been used as a housemaid," she said. "That is what I was employed as. That is not what you are." She did not know what to do with this sentence. She turned it over in her mind while she stood there, in the study with the serious books and the portrait of the woman in ivory, and she could not find a place to set it down safely. He said, "My late wife's correspondence required a secretary with particular skills. I have been told that no suitable woman could be found for the position. I did not understand, until yesterday, that this was because I was looking in the wrong rooms." She looked at him for a moment. She looked at the portrait. She said, "How long has she been gone?" The question was improper. It was the question of a person who had forgotten, for a moment, the precise distance between an earl and a housemaid. She felt the color rise in her face, and she did not lower her eyes, and she did not apologize. He said, 3 years. He said it the way he said everything, level, quiet, from a face that had arranged itself against disclosure. She heard, inside the levelness, the thing he had not said. She thought of the portrait. She thought of the piano she had heard played sometimes in the music room, a piano that never reached the end of any piece. "I am sorry," she said. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "The position would require someone who could manage correspondence, accounts, household matters that have gone unmanaged. It would require someone with particular qualities. Someone I could trust." He stopped. He looked at the ledger. He said, as if to the ledger, "I find that I am left with only one candidate." Nora stood with her hands at her sides and felt the world tilt very slightly on its axis. She said, "The household will not like it." "No," he said. He looked up from the ledger. "I find that does not concern me as much as it once did." He said nothing else. She understood this to be a dismissal of the practical kind, the kind that preceded rather than terminated an arrangement, and she turned and went back down the stairs and past Mrs. Albright's door and into the laundry passage where the basket of linen was still sitting, still waiting, and she picked it up. She stood there in the passage with the basket on her hip, and she thought very carefully about what had just been offered to her, and she thought about what it was not. It was not a declaration. It was not a resolution. It was one clear fact in a house full of unclear things, and she was a person who had spent her life working with facts, and she knew better than most that a single clear fact at the beginning of a problem was not the problem solved. It was only the first number. The rest of the column still had to be added up. The rest of the column took 11 weeks. In those 11 weeks, Mrs. Peel spread the story at every social call she made in the neighboring houses, which were not many, but were sufficient. The story, as she told it, changed slightly with each telling, the way small fictions do when they are nourished. By the 5th telling, Nora had not merely introduced errors into the accounts. She had done so with the express purpose of ruining an honest man in order to raise herself to a position she had no right to occupy. By the 9th telling, a motive had been supplied. By the 12th, the motive had been embellished to include the Earl himself. Nora heard about this from Betsy, who was a conscientious keeper of accounts in her own way, the accounts of what was being said and by whom, and to how many people. She heard it, each time, and she did not say anything, because there was nothing useful to say. The story was a story. The ledgers were fact. The solicitor from Taunton had reviewed the accounts and confirmed, in writing, the nature and extent of the irregularities, and Mr. Peel was no longer at Hartwell. This did not silence the story. Stories do not stop because they are wrong. What Nora had in those 11 weeks was work. She had the correspondence, which was extensive and had been badly organized. She had the household accounts, which she rebuilt from the ground up. She had the library catalogue, which had not been updated in 4 years, and the management of which the Earl mentioned, one morning in the study, had been his late wife's particular care. Nora did not say anything when he said this. She wrote the task down in the household book. She had the children, also. 2 of them, both young, Edmund, who was 7, and Clara, who was 5, who had been in the charge of a nurse who had left in the summer and had not yet been replaced, so that they currently moved between the nursery and various members of the household, like small polite ships with no harbor. They found Nora early. Edmund found her in the library first, on a Tuesday morning when she was cataloging the 3rd shelf from the bottom, and he sat down on the floor beside her and said, without preamble, that he was supposed to be doing his letters. "Are you meant to be somewhere?" she said. "Mrs. Albright said I might stay near you," he said, with the confidence of a child who had already negotiated this at the source. So he did his letters beside her on the library floor, and Clara arrived 20 minutes later, and did not do letters, but drew very elaborate pictures of horses in the margins of a piece of paper Nora had designated for the purpose. This became, by the 2nd week, a regular arrangement. By the 5th week, the Earl had passed the library door on 3 separate occasions, when all 3 of them were inside it. And on none of those occasions had he entered. But on 2 of them he had stood in the doorway for a moment longer than passing required. She was aware of him the way she was always aware of him. The warmth of it, the electricity of it, ran along her skin like the air before a summer storm. She did not permit herself to examine this too closely. She had a position. She had work that needed doing. She had children who needed a steady hand, and a household that needed management, and an Earl who had shown her a clear and careful respect that was worth more to her than most things she had been offered in her life. She was not going to do anything foolish with it. She did not sleep well many nights. She had not slept particularly well in years. The occasion that changed the arrangement of things was Mrs. Devitt's dinner. Mrs. Devitt was the nearest great house, 4 miles down the Taunton road, and she had known the Earl since childhood, and had liked his wife, and had kept a polite and slightly wary distance in the 3 years since her death. She was a woman of 60, with opinions about the social order that she held, with the same confidence with which she held her views on weather and good breeding, as natural laws rather than preferences. She was not malicious. She was the kind of person who could do considerable harm without any malice at all. She invited the Earl to dinner in the 3rd week of January, and the Earl accepted, and she included in the party 3 other families from the neighboring houses, one of whom was the Peel family's cousin, who had heard Mrs. Peel's story in its most embellished form. Nora was not invited. She would not have expected to be. She had not been thinking about the dinner at all, having been entirely occupied with the household quarter accounts, which needed to be submitted to the Earl by the Friday of that week. She had the figures in good order by Thursday afternoon, and she was cross-referencing the coal delivery records, which were kept in a separate book, when the Earl returned from the dinner. She heard him in the hall. She heard him speak to Thomas. She heard him come up the stairs to the study, which was unusual at this hour, and she heard him stop outside the door. And then he knocked, which he had never done before. She said, "Come in." He entered. He looked at the desk, at the book spread across it, at her pen still in hand. He looked at her face. She set down the pen. She said, "What has happened?" He said, "Mrs. Devitt has informed the room that you are an adventuress." She received this without visible change of expression, which she was good at. Specifically, he said, and the word was dry and precise, that you are a woman of no family and no standing who has inserted herself into my household by means of deliberate deception, and that your management of the accounts was in service of a larger scheme of which I am the object. She said, "I see. The gentleman from Ashmore," he said, "who is cousin to Mr. Peel, expanded upon this theme." She said, "I imagine he had a great deal to say." "He did," said the Earl. He was looking at her steadily, the way he had looked at the column of figures in the estate office, with the kind of attention that was not performed, but simply was. He said that a woman of your sort could only have made herself indispensable by methods he would not name in company. Nora picked up her pen. She set it down again. She said, "And what did you say?" He looked at the accounts book. He looked at her face. He said, "Not enough." The words fell into the room very quietly. She held them. "Not enough," she repeated. "I said that the allegations against you were disproved by the solicitor's report, and that you had the management of this household under better care than it had known in some time." He stopped. It was true. It was insufficient. She thought about Mrs. Devitt's dining room, full of people who had heard Mrs. Peel's story and had decided that it told them what kind of woman Nora Vane was. She thought about what it had cost him to say, even what he had said, in that room, at that table, against a cousin of an aggrieved steward and the 22 years of accumulated narrative that the man's grievance carried with it. She thought about the piano in the music room that never reached the end of any piece. She said, "You are allowed to say not enough. You are under no obligation to defend me to your neighbors." "You are wrong," he said. She looked at him. He moved from the door. He came to the desk, not beside it but across from it, and he put both hands on the surface of it. And he looked at her steadily with those gray eyes that had been looking at her, in one way or another, since the first morning in the estate office. He said, "Nora." It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it in her chest, the specific weight of it, the way a well-fitted key feels in a lock that has been stiff for too long. He said, "I have been, since October, entirely incapable of going more than half a day without finding a reason to pass whatever room you are in. I am aware that this is not a dignified admission." She did not speak. She could not, quite. He said, "I have also been aware, for a longer time than I am comfortable disclosing, that I have been allowing myself to keep things as they are, because changing them required a courage I was not certain I possessed. My wife died. I have been managing that fact poorly. The management took the form of a household that functioned without my attention. And then you arrived. And the household began functioning very well with your attention. And I began to notice the difference." He stopped. He looked at his hands on the desk. He said, "I am making a poor case of this." "You are making a perfectly clear case," she said. Her voice was not quite steady. "Then I will be plainer still." He straightened. He looked at her. "I am asking whether you would be willing to consider a change in your situation. A permanent one. I am asking whether there is any part of you that considers such a change to be possible, before I embarrass both of us further by stating what I mean outright." The fire in the grate was the only sound in the room. She was aware of her own heartbeat, of the particular quality of the candlelight, of the accounts book open on the desk with its column of figures she had not yet finished adding. She said, "I think you should state what you mean outright." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, "Will you marry me, Nora?" Not a question. A fact, offered with both hands open, the way he said everything that mattered, level and direct, and without ornamentation. She thought about her father. She thought about his study, and the thin light and the ledgers spread across every surface. She thought about what he had taught her, which was that figures did not lie, and that a person who could read them was a person who could see the world clearly, and that seeing the world clearly was its own kind of freedom. She said, "Yes." He did not smile. Something in his face changed. It was not as large a change as a smile, and it was more significant. It was the expression of a man who has been cold for a long time and has just come inside. He moved around the desk. He stood in front of her and she was standing by the time he reached her, and he took her hand, the right one, still holding the pen, and he held it in both of his. He said, "I will speak to Mrs. Devitt in the morning." She said, "She will not like it." He said, "No." She thought about Mrs. Devitt's dining room, and the cousin from Ashmore, and the story that had been traveling from house to house all through the winter. She thought about Mr. Peel's injured dignity, and the dismissive label he had chosen for her, and the 3 separate settings in which it had been used, each one a brick in a wall built to make her small enough to disappear behind. She thought, "I did not disappear." The morning was gray and cold when the Earl's carriage rolled up to the Hartwell Drive bearing his new secretary and intended wife, and also bearing a letter addressed to Mrs. Devitt, which he had written at the study desk before dawn, while Nora had worked beside him at the household books. The letter was short. It contained the facts of the situation, the solicitor's findings, and a single sentence at the close that Mrs. Devitt would later describe to her neighbors as unexpected and uncharacteristically warm, coming from a man whose warmth she had not seen since the loss of his wife. The sentence read, "Miss Vane has earned what this household is asking her to accept, and I have only done the same." The spring that came to Hartwell that year was early and particular. The snowdrops were already up in the kitchen garden in the first week of March, and the children had found them, and Edmund had brought one indoors in his fist, slightly crushed, and presented it to Nora in the library on a Saturday morning with the solemnity of a man conducting important business. She thanked him gravely. She put it in a small glass of water on the windowsill. The arrangement of the household had shifted in the weeks since January, not noisily, not with any formal announcement, but in the way that arrangements shift when something true has been said aloud at last. Mrs. Albright had expressed no surprise. Thomas the footman had expressed visible relief. For reasons that were obscure, but probably related to the general improvement in the household's management. The cousin from Ashmore had expressed a great deal, but at a distance, and to people who had by this point also received the solicitor's findings, and his expressions fell largely on ground that had already been prepared to receive them without much harvest. The piano in the music room had been played through to the end of 3 pieces in February. Nora had heard it from the study and had not stopped her work, because there was still a great deal of work. And she had learned not to stop when things were going well, only to listen. On the afternoon of the Saturday, when Edmund brought the snowdrop, The Earl came into the library at 4 o'clock and sat in the chair by the fire while Nora finished the last notation in the household book, the final column closed, the final sum correct. Clara was asleep on the small sofa with a blanket pulled over her and a drawing of a horse slipping from her hand. Nora closed the book. She set down her pen. The fire was low and steady, and the light was changing, going gold and thin, the particular light of early March in an English country house. He said, "Is it done?" "For the quarter," she said. "Yes." She looked at the snowdrop in its glass. She looked at his face, which had the expression she was learning to recognize, the expression that was not quite at rest, but was reaching toward it. She said, "Your wife's piano." He did not tense. He looked at the fire. "Clara has been asking about lessons," Nora said. "I did not want to presume." "She should have them," he said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Her mother played well." Nora said nothing. She let the sentence stand in the room, where it needed to stand. After a time he said, "She would have liked you." Nora looked at the woman in the ivory portrait that hung in the study, the painted eyes that held something between happiness and its absence. She thought about what it meant to be liked by someone you would never know. She thought about her father and his evenings of Latin declensions and double-entry bookkeeping, and how his liking for her had been the first accounting of her worth she had ever trusted. She said, "I would have liked to know her." He reached across the desk and put his hand over hers. It was a simple gesture, the kind that costs nothing to make and everything to mean, and they stayed like that while the fire burned low and the room grew warm, and Clara's drawing of the horse finally slipped from her fingers to the floor. The first snowdrops of that year stood in their glass on the library windowsill until their stems gave out, and they bent gracefully over the lip of the glass. Nora pressed one between the pages of the household book, where it remained, a small flattened thing, its season preserved in the margin of a correctly kept account. Thank you for staying until the end of this one. If Nora's patience moved you, leave a word for her in the quiet below.